Okay, good evening. I will be sitting, if you don't mind, because then I have full control over the computer, so it's easier for me. Okay. And so today we'll be speaking about, let me see, how do I make, I need some help here, I think, with the Mac, who is the expert I ask? Why is this picture on the full screen?
No, it is on the screen.
But here it's like that?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
fine.
You can just...
Okay, yeah, I know. Thanks. Okay, so we'll be speaking today about the Negev Highlands in the 3rd to 1st millennia BC. We will be speaking about the subsistence economy, about chronology, and finally, in a way, I will be offering you a new perspective, a new reconstruction, a new paradigm, if you wish, on the history of the Negev Highlands, starting in the Bronze Age, early Bronze Age, and until the Iron Age at least. So, first of all, a few words about the geography. Well, I'm sure that you all know the Negev Highlands. Here is on the left-hand side, you have a map showing you the location of the area where we have been working in the last 10 years. I mean, it's been 10 years since I started in the Negev Highlands. And also a typical picture which tells the whole story, because you see how arid the area is. It gets a little bit more precipitation than the rest of the area of the Negev because of altitude, combination of altitude, topography mainly, but also a little bit of the geology. And in the wadis there are those plots of agricultural fields that you can see in the background, terraces. And the picture is taken from a site, from an Iron Age site, so there is always the temptation to say that the terraces, agriculture is connected to the archaeological site, and especially in this case the Iron Age. And we have to check and see whether this is so. This is in fact the picture which tells the story why I started in the Negev Highlands. I have been interested in the arid zones of the Levant for a long time, and you may know that in 1995 I published a book in England, in the UK, which under the title Living on the Fringe, about the archaeology and history of the Negev and the Sinai, also in the Bronze and Iron Ages mainly. And then my interest subsided a little bit with the beginning of my excavations at Megiddo, and then raised again about 10 years ago. The reason was that I was always kind of bothered by this histogram that you see on the screen now, the oscillations of activity in the Negev Highlands, and the question is always, what's the reason for the oscillations? Are we dealing here with climate? Are we dealing here with the influence of northern powers on the Negev Highlands? There are several models that have been put on the table in order to explain the oscillations, including mine many years ago, 23 or 24 years ago, but still the question is there, out there. And so about 10 years ago, a colleague of mine, now we are working a lot together, then she came to me, a scholar that at that time she was in the Weizmann Institute, and now she's at Haifa. Her name is Ruth Shachar-Gross, an excellent scholar, researcher in the field of geoarchaeology. She came to me to ask me whether I'm interested to have her as a postdoc. And she came back from the United States after writing her PhD with a very prominent scholar there in the field of geoarchaeology. And I said, sure, why not? And the first thing that came to me regarding geoarchaeology was to carry out a different, let's put it this way, research in the Negev Highlands. And we started, in fact, over 10 years ago, and we are now in the phase of wrapping up, which means we devoted several years to work on the Iron Age, then we devoted several years to work on the Bronze Age, always with other scholars, always with PhD students, and now we are trying to wrap up the whole thing and to come up with some sort of a big summary of our work. Now, I must, on the background of this picture, I must say that my understanding of the situation when Ruth Shachar-Gross came to me 10 years ago or more, my understanding of the situation was that traditional archaeology has been exhausted. which means there have been many excavations in the Negev Highlands. If we take, for example, the IAA with the work of Rudolf Cohen in the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, or starting in the 70s, in fact, many sites were excavated. Iron Age, Intermediate Bronze Age, Early Bronze. But, more information did not, there was a point where the accumulation of information did not take us a step further, which means that my opinion was that if we wish to really understand what's going on, we have to come from a different angle. We have to take a different angle. And as you can see in this picture, today we have the very powerful tool of micro-archaeology. I suppose all of you, I don't have to preach to the converts, but that archaeology basically can today we are speaking about archaeology as being divided into two sectors or so. Macro-archaeology is what you actually see when you are in an excavation. You see the walls, you see the pottery, you see the animal bones, you see the debris of accumulations and so on and so forth. However, there is a side which one cannot see with the naked eye, that you have to put things under a microscope. And this is a whole world which is new and fascinating. And today we understand that without the incorporation of the micro-archaeology side, there is no way to fully comprehend the problem, because there are many items that can be, on which we can shed light only by looking at finds under the microscope. Let me just give you some examples. Geoarchaeology is one, residue analysis is another. In a way also you can say today more and more we are pushing towards ancient DNA and things like that. Not all of them are under a microscope, but the micro side is there. So you know that in the last few years microarchaeology made a big advance, a big progress in Israel. And we started, Ruth Shachar-Gross and me, before in the Negev Highlands, but in 2009 I assembled a big team to carry out a project that was funded by the European Research Council. And it was titled Iron Age Archaeology and the Exactance and Life Sciences. And we carried out several fields of investigation, and in several fields we also touched on the question of the Negev, which means that the project in the Negev, which started in a little bit before 2009, was then incorporated into the ERC project. And what I'm going to tell you today, to describe to you today, is the result of a teamwork. And I'm very proud of this team. I think it really was a great pleasure to work with them. And this is only part of the team that was involved in the ERC project. And I'm showing you here in the yellow squares the people who were involved in the work in the Negev. So for instance, Thomas Litt, not all of them are Israelis. Thomas Litt from Bonn was into palynology. There is a physicist Pisetsky sitting here. Mario Martin did petrography. Daphna Lango did palynology. Then you have two researchers who did metallurgy, and then we have the radiocarbon team, and so on and so forth. So all these people were involved in the work in the Negev Highlands, and I will try to summarize the work here today. So here's the thing. We wish to start with the Iron Age, and well, I need the screen. Where is Anne?
Anne.
Can you help me just a minute here? I'm sorry. I don't like the Mac. I hate it, in fact. Yeah, I cannot read here. So can you put this on the screen, big on the screen, this side? No.
Where is it?
This one, yeah. Can you make it a full screen? For me. Because otherwise I cannot, I need to read in order to follow, the line of thought. If not, never mind. Yeah, try this. Okay, great, wonderful.
I'm not sure.
I love it.
No, yes. It is coming.
I know.
So,
Okay, never mind. So put it as it was, as it used to be. Okay, fine. So in that case, I will be sitting here and shouting, and I will be reading from. I'll take it here. I will be reading from the screen if I need to. So the Iron Age open research questions, you can see them on the screen now. First of all, a few pictures of the sites in the highlands. Some of them look like fortresses, and you know that there was a big question whether we are dealing with fortresses or not, and this debate started many years ago, I mean in the 80s or in the late 70s already. And then the map of the main Iron Age sites in the Negev Highlands, which means the area around Sde Boker, south of Beersheba, in the area of Mitzpe Ramon, and so on. And many of these sites were excavated in the 70s, well, in the 60s even, some of them, and then until the 90s. But the questions are still there. After maybe of this site, 20 maybe were excavated, if not more. And then the questions are, the exact date was still open when I started there. Then the subsistence economy was a question, big question. And the reasons for the supposed sedentarization of the people who inhabited the sites, and the origin of the population. So all these questions were on the table after so many years of research. And now you understand why I'm saying that the accumulation of more information was not so helpful. I mean, we had to take a different track in order to try to solve these questions. And indeed, we started working in the Negev Highlands, and we decided on purpose to work in one area. And indeed, you'll see later that we continued also in the Bronze Age in the same area, which means in order to work in the same environment, basically with the same conditions. And we decided to work near Sde Boker, south of Beersheba. Elevation here is about something like 550, 600 meters above sea level. Precipitation around 100 millimeters per year. However, the wadis get more water because of the flow of the floods, because of when there is rain, the wadis get basically more water than the slopes or the top of the hills. And we worked in 3 sites in the area of the Boker, started with Atar Haroah, that you see on the right hand side in the red circle. So here is Atar Haroah from the air, and the site has several components. It's a very typical site in the Negev Highlands. There is the fortress, quote unquote, looks like a fortress, but there are many reasons to doubt the function as a fortress. I'm not going to go into this now. And in the last few years, most scholars really suggested that we are dealing with some sort of sedentarization of nomadic groups, pastoral nomads who preserve the traditions of the encampment, tent encampment, and the tents when they shifted to stone architecture. And then there is the settlement, buildings on the left-hand side. One of the buildings was excavated by Rudolf Cohen, you see it over there. The settlement continued also over here. Then there is a cistern not far, and the wadi terraces, and something that was interpreted as a threshing floor. So it's a spread out site with several components, and basically what we decided to do is to conduct a geoarchaeology investigation. What were we looking for? We were looking for, this is Rochach Gross, my partner in this, my colleague partner in this endeavor, and we were looking for phytolites. You can see the explanation, microscopic silica bodies, which preserve the shape of the vegetation cells, and then we were looking also for spherolites, microscopic calcite bodies, which originate from the animal's dung. They come with the animal's dung. So this is important because the phytolites, these are microscopic bodies that you can see only under a microscope in the sediments. So you take a sample from the sediments, you put it under a microscope, and you try to see what kind of phytolites, if you get, the concentration of phytolites, and what kind of phytolites you get. And in the phytolites, you can identify the vegetation because the cells have different shape. So you can see whether you have, for instance, cereals in the phytolites or not. And then you have the spherolites. So this was the beginning of the study in Atar Horoah, and the results were really surprising. We published the results in the Journal of Archaeological Science about 10 years ago, but we were less than fully confident in what we and with the results. We were a little bit nervous about them. Why? Because the result was that let's put it this way: the conventional wisdom was that what we see here is sedentarization of pastoral nomads, and that they carried out what was the subsistence? They carried out opportunistic, seasonal dry farming, the way that we see the dry farming of the Bedouin today. I mean, this is the picture that I took in the Negev maybe 5-6 years ago. And of course also animal husbandry, and possibly also other lines of subsistence like participating in copper transportation and things like this. So this was the idea. However, when we carried out the work at Atar Horoah, we discovered that there is no evidence for cereal growing. There was no evidence for dry farming whatsoever. This was surprising. However, the sediments for the courtyard showed us that there were many spherolites, which means that we had evidence for strong animal husbandry having been conducted in these sites. So no agriculture, but yes, animal husbandry. This was the result. However, as I said to you, we were kind of nervous about the results because they were so much different than the conventional wisdom. Although, conventional wisdoms are there in order to be, checked or investigated or verified, if you wish. So we decided to do it again, to go to another site. And we shifted from Atar Horoah to this one, Nahal Boker, which is maybe 5-6 kilometers away in the same environment. And the result was the same. No agriculture, not even seasonal dry farming. This, of course, raises severe questions regarding another conventional wisdom, that is to say that the terraces in the Negev Highlands belong to the sites. Because if there is no agriculture, why terrace? Animal husbandry, they don't need terraces for, pasture. So this was the situation. And we were still nervous. You can imagine, we were still nervous about this. Austin is laughing, but we were still nervous, yes, about the results of this study. And then we said, well, let's put all our money in one basket. The ultimate check, which was, today I think about it, was a little bit risky. Sometimes you have to be careful with another check. So we decided to check a Byzantine site. Because for the Byzantine period, we had evidence we had textual evidence, let's say from the Nisana papyri, for instance, for agriculture in the Negev Highlands. So the question was the following: if we don't find evidence, phytolite evidence in this site, we are done basically. So something is very wrong with what we are doing. And lo and behold, we were not lucky maybe, but it proved to be useful because here the site was full of phytolites with evidence for agriculture, cereal growing and other lines of agriculture. So this was the ultimate verification that we are not completely wrong in what we are doing, and it was supporting and important to have this kind of information. So we were okay with the investigation. But then we had in front of us new questions, and the new questions were: pastoral nomads are not likely to sedentarize. Why to sedentarize? There must be a reason. So what was the reason for the sedentarization? Our perspective, that our very sedentary perspective, doesn't matter whether it's Rome, Sydney, Jerusalem, or New York. Our sedentary perspective is that sedentary life is good, and that pastoral nomads, their ultimate dream is to become, a settler, inhabiting a city or whatever. But this is, of course, our perspective. It's not their perspective. It's very different when you start investigating pastoral nomadic groups and their history. So what was the reason for the sedentarization process? If we are dealing with pastoral nomads, and this was the evidence, pastoral nomadism was there because of the animal husbandry. And then did the Negev people have other economic resources which dictated sedentarization? And then the question, if they don't have grain in the Negev Highlands, where did they take the grain from? So new questions were on the table. In order to ask them, we took a different course a little bit from the initial investigation, and we started by working first of all on chronology. Chronology was important, you'll see why later, in order to make the connection with the archaeology farther to the north in the settled lands, and also in order to understand things on the background of what was going on in research in parallel to us in the Araba Valley about copper production in the Araba. So it was very important for us to verify the date. And you know that many years ago, the idea was that the sites in the Negev Highlands, they represent the United Kingdom of ancient Israel in the time of King Solomon, along the roads to the Gulf, the head of the Gulf of Aqaba for reasons of trade, and so on and so forth. This was one way of controlling the Negev. Now, of course, this view became less popular in the last 20 years or so. With it also, there were question marks on the chronology. We knew that the sites date to the Iron 2A basically, or late Iron 1 and Iron 2A, those of you who are familiar with this terminology. But the question was when exactly, because this was then became a component in the bigger debate over chronology of the Iron Age. So we decided to start with chronology. We managed easily to extract samples for radiocarbon dating, good samples, short-lived for radiocarbon dating, and here are the results. The results basically leave no space, no room for too many questions. Where you can see consistently that probably a site like this the activity started in the 10th century indeed, but most of the activity took place in the 9th century and relatively until late in the 9th century, which means that the idea of a wave of settlement in the middle of the 10th century, in the time of King Solomon, and then destruction by Sheshonq I in the late 10th century is out of the question here, because the sites continue deep into the 9th century, as you can see in this graph, and we published the results in the journal Radiocarbon several years ago. So this was about chronology, and this, as I mentioned to you, raised the interest in looking into the results of Tom Levy's work, University of California, San Diego, in Wadi Fainan, especially in Khibet Nachas. Why especially Khibet Nachas? You can see Khibet Nachas here. This is the main site for copper production in the Araba south of the Dead Sea. And why Nachas? Because at Nachas there were very many, over 100 samples that were taken for radiocarbon dating. So we had a very good control, so to speak, Tom Levy and us by proxy, good control over chronology in these sites. So here's the picture. Without going into too many details of how this was done, and it's not so easy because there are some methodological questions here, but we can say quite confidently that the site of Khibet Nachas, copper production, started at the end of the late Bronze Age, but in kind of low volume, if you wish. And then the volume grew, and the peak is sometimes in the 10th century and the 9th century. And then after 800 BC, there is a very dramatic drop, almost nothing, which means the main period of production at Khibet Nachas is in the 10th and 9th centuries, and this is in parallel to the wave of settlement in the Negev Highlands. So it's in parallel to this, to this. Here we have starting in the 10th century and main phase in the 9th century, and here basically we have the same picture, 10th and 9th centuries. So there must be some sort of a connection between the two. And then, of course, we know today This a theory which was put forward for the first time, I think, in the middle of the 90s by, I think, Axel Knauf was the first scholar to speak about it, that the history of copper production in the Araba is connected to copper production in Cyprus, in the sense that there are ups and downs between Cyprus, you can see them here, Cyprus and the Araba. In the Araba, I mark for you Wadi Fenan and the area of Timna as well. So, in what sense? That in the third millennium, main activity was, the main producer of copper in the region was the Araba, south of the Dead Sea. In the second millennium, the main producer is Cyprus, and they know already how to ship copper from Cyprus. And then there is a very dramatic decline in activity in the Araba. In fact, almost nothing for the Middle Bronze Age, for instance, and almost nothing for most of the Late Bronze Age. But then, with the collapse of the Eastern Mediterranean, this is Axel Knauf, okay? With the collapse of the East Mediterranean trade at the end of the Late Bronze Age, we have we have again a decline in Cyprus and a rise instead of the Araba as the main supplier of copper in the Levant and beyond. So these are the ups and downs. And indeed, work which we conducted, you can see the lead scholars were, the lead researchers were Naama Yahalomak and Adi Eliyahu Behar. They were the lead scholars here. Carried out an investigation about new insights into Levantine copper trade, analysis of ingots from the Bronze and Iron Ages in Israel. And we saw that indeed this is the case in the ingots, which means that the signal, the chemical signal of the copper led us, let's say, in the certain period of the Iron Age to Cyprus, but before the Late Bronze Age, or most of the Late Bronze Age, in the Middle Bronze Age, to Cyprus and later to Fenan, which means there was a verification of the Knauf theory from the 1990s. Then the next question for us was, so who produced the copper in the Araba Valley? And this, until now, there are some different voices about this. You know that my colleague, young colleague at Tel Aviv, Erez Ben Yosef, who is working at Timna, still plays a little bit with the idea that Judah of the 10th and 9th centuries was involved in the copper production, and Tom Levy the same way. I see it very differently, and I think that Tom Levy himself, here in the picture, produced the ultimate evidence, and this is the very interesting cemetery that he excavated not so far from Khirbet Fenan, with hundreds of burials, from the same period exactly, from the 10th century, 9th century. And these were, according to the goods that were brought to the, put in the graves, these were the desert people probably, the people who carried out the work at Fenan. So we are speaking then about desert group at Fenan, producing the copper and transporting the copper to the main centers in the north. And then the main powers of the north take over, if you wish, along the desert, along the roads. And then the question, of course, is where was the center of this production? Was it over here in Wadi Fenan, or maybe there was a major site in the Beersheba Valley? I'll say a few words about it in a minute. In Tel Masos, we will leave this open for a while, for a minute. But then we have to ask the question, what was the connection between the Negev, or even before? Is there a way to show connection between the Negev Highlands and the copper production sites in the Araba? Because the chronology-wise, there is a connection, okay? But this, and population-wise, there is a connection. If we say that both were representation of pastoral nomadic groups. But we really had to prove this, to show the actual connection regarding copper. So we decided to carry out this very interesting work. Mario Martin was the lead researcher on this. We carried out petrographic investigation of vessels from sites in the Negev Highlands, and especially these cooking pots, the Negev pots, as we used to call them, handmade, typical of the sites in the Iron 2A, late 10th and 9th centuries BC. And the results were very interesting because we discovered that in a large number of the vessels, you can see copper slag in the petrography, which means they used copper slag as inclusions in the production of the pottery. And on this there can be no question. I mean, you can really prove that this is copper, so the meaning is that those vessels were produced in Wadi Fenan or in Timna, and we can even say, I'm not going to go into this now, we can even say whether there is a way to say whether we are in Timna or in Wadi Fenan, because the geological formation where copper was quarried from is not the same in Timna and Wadi Fenan, although we are dealing with the same phenomenon. So we had the ultimate proof for connection regarding copper between the Negev Highlands and the Araba south of the Dead Sea, copper production in the Araba. The next question was the following. So we are left with the question of supply of grain. Okay? Perhaps so we know all the rest now. Perhaps the Negev people did not participate or practice, opportunistic agriculture because of weather drier than today. So for this we had an answer. Why? Because in the capacity of the ERC project, the European Research Council project, we carried out paleoclimate investigation. Daphna Langgut and Thomas Leet, you can see two of them here, and also Moti Stein from the Hebrew University was part of it, and the Israel Geology Service. They were part of this, and we extracted cores of sediments from the Sea of Galilee and from the Dead Sea, and counted pollen along the core, which can be dated. I mean, the core can be dated according to organic material in the core. And then, if you combine the several radiocarbon dates with the laminations, with the laminas in the core, you can really reach good chronology, good grasp over chronology. So the answer was really interesting here, because we know today that the period that we are dealing with is not a period of is not a dry period. There was a dry event in the Levant in the, let's say, between 1250 and 1100 BC, which means the later phases of the Late Bronze Age. And it was a major one, and it was an important one, and it is important for reconstructing the history of the region. But it has nothing to do with the sites that we are speaking about. As you can see, in the Iron 1 and the Iron 2A, between the two red lines, we are in a humid phase. This we see according to the pollen. What we see in pollen, we see the vegetation around the lakes. And according to this, we can reconstruct, precipitation, basically, grosso modo. So we are when we say humid, we mean probably a bit humid than today. When we say dry, we mean much drier than today. So this is the picture. And here is the publication in Panelology. So they did not practice seasonal agriculture, not because they could not, because they decided not to. Because there was another way of bringing grain, of obtaining grain, and they devoted their time to animal husbandry and participation in production of copper and transportation of copper. This is what we see. And possibly also other lines of subsistence, which I'm not going to elaborate on today. We don't have enough time for that. So where is the grain from? The grain is probably from the Beersheba Valley. As you can see, nice picture of the Beersheba Valley in a good year. And we are dealing with a period which is more humid than today. So probably here. And there is even one piece of evidence that can support this idea. And the evidence comes from archaeological work, first of all, many years ago, in the Beersheba Valley on the site of Tel Masos. Tel Masos is contemporaneous to the activity in the Negev Highlands. It is also let's say, very late Iron 1 and mainly Iron 2A in the late 10th century and 9th century. So, and then we revisited the archaeology of the site during the ERC project, and we composed this map that shows you the percentage of cattle from sheep-goat plus cattle in the site. And what's really surprising is the very meaningful, significant percentage of cattle at Tel Masos, which is located in a region where you would not envision, big percentage of cattle. And why is that? Probably because of the need of cattle for plowing. If dry farming was indeed conducted there in a significant way. So here we are closing another point, and now we can really wrap up the Iron Age and say the following, that we can see how probably copper production in the Araba, which replaced the declining production in Cyprus because of the collapse in the Eastern Mediterranean, well, this copper production was, if you wish to say, the prime mover in this process of sedentarization of pastoral groups in the Negev Highlands in the 10th century and into the 9th century. And then it continued like that until the late 9th century. And then when Cyprus came back to life in the late Iron 2A, if you wish, in the late 9th century, also connections between Damascus and Cyprus at that time, the days of Hazael, king of Damascus. Then Cyprus started shipping copper again, and this brought about the decline of the production in the Araba. So this is the story. So this is the first part. Then the question is the following. As you may remember, let's take a look just a minute on this. As you can see, there are two major waves of settlement in the Negev Highlands before. So what you can see here, the Iron Age, over here, this is the number of sites in the service. Not necessarily all of them at the same time, but basically in the same slot. Iron Age 2A, about 450. Here almost nothing. Almost nothing in the middle bronze and late bronze, because of the declining copper production, so declining also of settlement activity. This one. But there are two peaks also in the early bronze, two, and the intermediate bronze age. Or this, at least, was the conventional wisdom, that we have here two peaks. But see how the conventional wisdom worked. The idea was that there is the first peak in the early bronze 2, then there is a decline with nothing in the early bronze 3, and then there is another peak in the intermediate bronze age, which means the late third millennium. This early bronze 2, beginning of the third millennium. Here, late third millennium. In between, several centuries with no activity. This was the idea. And then again big decline. And then again a peak in the decline, and then this is already later periods with later concerns. Forget about them now. So we decided indeed to shift from the Iron Age to the Bronze Age to see whether the pattern works in the same way. This was the question, research question that we put on the table like 5 years ago or so. And we started working in the several sites in the Negev. So here's the situation. The traditional paradigm also regarding the Bronze Age, several periods with large number of sites, other periods with no sites, subsistential periods of prosperity, mainly animal husbandry and opportunistic dry farming, based on the shape of the site, grinding stones found, sickle blades found, and so on and so forth, comparison to modern, nowadays Bedouin in the Negev Highlands. So we decided to start work in the Negev Highlands. Yes, for the Negev in the third millennium. So as I mentioned already, wave in the EBIT in the early Bronze 2, no site in the early Bronze 3, another wave in the intermediate Bronze Age, and so on and so forth. So this was the paradigm, the traditional paradigm. And here I show you the site of Arad, because the idea was that there was a connection in the early Bronze 2 prosperity in the Negev, prosperity in Arad. In the early Bronze Tree, decline in the Negev, decline in Arad. Arad does not function anymore, did not survive some sort of an event at the end of the EB2, early Bronze 2. So here is Arad, first of all, location of the Negev Highlands, location of Arad. The idea is that Arad is the gateway community, if you wish, for these groups, in the same way that Tel Masos served in the Iron Age. And then we started working in the Negev Highlands. So we worked all together in the Negev Highlands. We decided to work on the Intermediate Bronze Age. And in the Intermediate Bronze, the conventional wisdom was that there are several big sites and many small sites, like 6 or 7 big sites and almost hundreds of small sites in the Negev Highlands. So we worked in 2 big sites, large sites, Mashabei Sadeh and Ein Zik. This is Ein Zik over here on the left-hand side. And we worked in 2 sites, or 3 sites, in fact, at the end, 2 small sites. And the results, you can understand now already, were surprising. So, yes, I have to add, it's a little bit complicated, excuse me, but I have to add here, in the background, there was a very dramatic change in our understanding of the chronological framework of the early Bronze and Intermediate Bronze Age, as a result of a big project that was carried out here by the Weizmann Group, Institute Group, by Pierre de Mirochegi, by several scholars from the Israel Antiquities Authority and others, a big group. And they did a very good job at taking samples from sites, early Bronze sites, including, by the way, from Megiddo, where I excavate. And the results were also surprising, because we saw that, unlike the conventional wisdom, the early Bronze ends around 2500, and the Intermediate Bronze starts then. So the early Bronze is shorter, the Intermediate Bronze is longer, and also there were changes regarding the early Bronze 2 and 3. Now, this may sound to you like, who cares, right? Well, we do care. Why we care? For many reasons. One of the reasons is that this makes a big change vis-a-vis the connection of the Negev with Egypt. Because in Egypt, the things did not change. I mean, the Old Kingdom continues until around 2200 BC. So you see that before there was some sort of a harmony between the Negev and Egypt, and now all of a sudden all this harmony is destroyed. And we will get back to this when I wrap up this very soon. So here's the situation. Regarding subsistence, we discovered a dichotomy between the large and small sites. In the large sites, there is no evidence for dry farming. More surprising, in the large sites, there is no evidence for animal husbandry. More surprising, in the large sites, there is no evidence for copper production. There is evidence for copper transportation, which means copper items found in the sites. But there is no evidence for really the big sites serving as settlements, if you wish. And the big sites are only in the Intermediate Bronze Age, chronology-wise. I'll show you in a minute. Whereas the small sites, for instance, the one on the right-hand side here, there is evidence. There's no evidence for dry farming, but there is evidence for animal husbandry. More surprising, the small sites are not only Intermediate Bronze Age. More surprising, the small site provided evidence, radiocarbon evidence, for continuity from the early Bronze 1 all the way to the Intermediate Bronze, including the time which was supposed to be empty in the early Bronze 3. Here's the evidence. Look on the left-hand side. On the left-hand side, we see Ein Zik. This is the large site. Now pay attention that Intermediate Bronze Age starts in 2500 BC. However, radiocarbon evidence is only in the second half of the Intermediate Bronze Age. Okay? And then take a look on the right-hand side, and you can see in Nahal Boker that there is continuity. The radiocarbon hints at continuity of activity, and these sites, not necessarily every year, possibly, even seasonal sometimes, but anyway, activity starting very early, in the early Bronze One before 3000 BC, and continuing all the way to when? All the way to the second half of the Intermediate Bronze Age. So this is a revolution. It changes our entire perspective of what's going on in the Negev Highlands. Also, big surprise, then we said to ourselves, what's going on here? If we see that the Negev Highlands continues in the early Bronze III against the conventional wisdom, let's check Arad afresh, because Arad was supposed to be deserted in the early Bronze III, like the Negev Highlands. But if the Negev Highlands, if there is activity there, why not at Arad? So we did something very simple. We looked at the old radiocarbon dates at Arad, and the evidence is very clear. But this is a typical situation in, having some sort of construction in your head. There was a theory, and whatever did not fit the theory was brushed under the carpet as, outlier and this and that and so on. But when you look at the evidence, it's very clear that Arad is active also in the early Bronze III. So this is also a change regarding Arad. We are going to Arad this April to try to check for radiocarbon samples in the sections there and to illuminate this situation even better. So let's summarize. There are several things to say. Summary of the results: the old paradigm of two waves of settlement in the Negev Highlands in the early Bronze and Intermediate Bronze in the Bronze Age does not stand anymore. There is continuity there. Then activity in the Intermediate Bronze Age is restricted mainly I said before the second half, the first half of the period. Then activity at Arad probably continues until the end of the early Bronze III, and so on and so forth. And we also came to the conclusion that we can make a distinction between two phases in the Negev Highlands. The first phase was in the early Bronze, and the second phase was in the beginning of the Intermediate Bronze Age, until around 2200 BC or something like that, when activity continues. And then there is a decline. So this is the first phase, with all the details. I don't want to tire you by reading the whole thing. And this is the second phase. And it became crystal clear to us that here too there is connection with copper production in Egypt. And why is that? Because in the Feinan area south of the Dead Sea, there is now evidence from the excavations of Hauptmann and for the work that has been conducted by Tom Levy, for prosperity mainly in the early Bronze III, which according to the new chronology starts around 2900 BC, until the end of the first phase of the Intermediate Bronze Age, until 2200. So there is evidence for about 700 years of continuity, although copper production starts before. And what we are saying now is that there is a reason to think that that here too, copper was the prime mover, which means there was demand for copper in Egypt, growing starting in the 4th dynasty, and even growing better in the time of the Old Kingdom, 5th dynasty, into the 6th dynasty. However, when Egypt collapsed at the end of the 6th dynasty, around 2200 BC, this was also the time when the Negev activity declined, because there was no same demand for copper anymore on the side of Egypt. So we see that we have some sort of a solution. What's the meaning of all this? The meaning of all this that the reconstruction, the historical reconstruction, based on archaeology, based on radiocarbon, based on copper production, based on geoarchaeology and what we see there, there is a big similarity between the wave in the Bronze Age, which is not two waves, but one wave, which is mainly in the early Bronze III and intermediate Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. So this is a whole new concept for the settlement history of the Negev Highlands. We are left, and this will be, I will wrap up the presentation with this, we are still left with the question. And the question is that after all, with all what I'm saying, there is a big difference. Something happens at the end of the early Bronze, because at the end of the early Bronze, the beginning of the intermediate, we have a change in the kind of sites that we see in the Negev Highlands, especially the big sites in the Negev Highlands, and Arad declines. So there is a change after all. And for this we need an answer. I'm not sure that I can provide you with an answer, but we have a clue, maybe, big question mark. And this is work that we have been doing recently with a student, an advanced student, on the Sorek Cave near Jerusalem. The Sorek Cave is very important near Bet Shemesh, you know. The Sorek Cave is very important because it gives you in the spelling terms, a very good record of precipitation right on top of the cave. And there was a very good research that had been conducted for the early periods by Mira Bar-Matthews and Ayalon and others regarding the early periods. But they did not continue really in high resolution into the second millennium. So Daphne Langot and I went to Mira Bar-Matthews from the Israel Geology Service, and we told her, do you still have spell items? She said, yes, look under the table. No, they were all under the table there. So we told her, can we date them? She said, sure. And we took together a student to date the spell items and see whether we can really check the spell items for the period after 3000 BC or so, which was not very well covered by the previous research. And Ben Laugemer did this, he was very successful, and the result is interesting. Here is the result. I'm not going to go into very many details here, but there is some sort of, yes, what's beautiful here, that the speleothem was very good. And he managed to conduct the study in a very high resolution of a sample every 2 or 3 years along the speleothem. And the result is surprising because we see some sort of an event over here around 2600 BC, a dry event, according to the isotopic evidence. There is some sort of a dry event. So I'm saying this very carefully because it needs to be rechecked and rechecked. We are now in the process of publishing this because had there been some sort of an event, it's a short event of like 70 years or so. Had there been an event like this, it would have affected strongly, the Beersheba Valley and the Negev Highlands more than the region to the north. And we are even now in the process of calculating the meaning of this regarding precipitation in the Negev Highlands at that time vis-a-vis what we know today. So we will see. This is still being done. Yes, I think that we will stop right here. So I will skip all this. I wanted to speak a little bit about water in the Negev Highlands. This is for the next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Israel. We knew your capacity of shaping the dominant paradigm in many of your previous...
It's not me, it's the evidence.
Yeah. And as well, when I visited with you last year, your new excavation in Yerim, I was fascinated by the use of many new technologies. And I find that really we can see results of that. So the floor is open for certainly many questions.
Austin wants to ask a question.
It's a wonderful presentation, and I really like to take up your time. Sorry. Thank you. I work in Transjordan, and I've seen the same patterns. But I'm delighted to see that you bring this new methodology to establishing the continuity of settlement, which we have suspected was there, but you are really demonstrating it. The one question I have as I listen to your line of reasoning about these patterns is that you're putting the primary focus on material drivers. But what about the possibility that in this region there is a resilient polycentrism that comes from other social factors, including the egalitarian ways, the pastoral nomads and so forth, that that makes this region simply harder to pump up. And so, later on, eventually, we do see intensification going on and sustaining. But there is something more to the drivers than simply the material factors, would be my observation.
Yes, I agree. Maybe I did not emphasize enough that we are not thinking about, disappearance of the groups from the Negev Highlands in the low periods. And there is even pieces of evidence for the low period in the second millennium. For instance, recently there is a publication by Steve Rosen about this cave that he excavates near Mitzpe Ramon. And there is another site. Here and there are signals that we are speaking also about the anthropological, if you wish, process of more along the continuum of more sedentary and more pastoral. But so my question regarding prime mover is not for the very existence of people in the Negev Highlands, it's for the shift to stone settlements, if you wish, sedentarization, which limits subsistence on animal husbandry, because then, pasture area is smaller and so on and so forth.
But that still involves social organization.
Right, yes, I agree. I fully agree with you about this, and I know very well you work in Transjordan, which is wonderful, it's great, but I agree. I fully agree with this.
Thank you for your lecture, Mr. Finkelstein. In terms of a drive for sedentarization coming from the copper coming out of the Arava, how exactly, though, do you understand that to be working? As in, what is it specifically about the copper trade, as I understand from your publications and your lecture tonight you were talking about, that actually drives sedentarization? As in, what is it about that is particularly involved in the economic activity of that copper trade, and why that, as opposed to nomads continuing to be involved in copper trade, even still living a primarily nomadic lifestyle as opposed to a sedentary one?
Good question. Thank you. I think that I'm not sure that I can provide a full answer. There are many things there that are still with a question mark. But I think part of it is, if you bear with me just a minute, to start with copper production, this was also your question. So then this is sort of a mover, a prime mover, an important mover in the process. So what's going on is that the desert people cannot they can operate the mines, but if they wish to carry out animal husbandry in a significant way, they can hardly do it around the mines, because the area is very arid, and it's much better 50-60 kilometers away to the west, where, because of elevation, you have better precipitation and better conditions for pasture, for animal husbandry. So then why do they sedentarize? This is what you're asking, of course. Why not to continue as pastoral groups at the same time? My answer would be that, first of all, some of them probably continued as pastoral groups, which means I'm not in the business of zero-sum game, that everybody sedentarizes, in the Iron Age. I suppose that while people are sedentarizing, groups are sedentarizing, some groups, including maybe even the same groups, part of the same groups are not. They continue pastoral nomadism. Those who settle down, the idea, as far as I understand it, is division of work, which means if there is a family, if there is a clan, or a household that sedentarizes, then there is division of work, and if some of the people move out of the system to the copper production, so this by itself may force limitation on animal husbandry, on the capacity to move in large areas, because they have less people to participate in pasture business. So this can be the answer, but I'm not sure this is the only answer. As I told you, there are things which I cannot explain. Oh, not yet, at least.
Thank you, that was fascinating. Obviously, someone likes to compliment. I'm not going to ask you about compliment, just asking you a naive question. If these nomads still ate grain,
If
they still ate grain, why are there no phytolites in your residential areas?
because I think the phytolites come, if I understand well, mainly when you have the branches there. When you really do the work, you harvest and you do the work, you bring the result of the harvest to your courtyard and you work the grain over there. If you bring the grain already produced, let's say from the market in Beersheba, I'm taking an example of recent generations where the Bedouin in the Negev Highlands used to go to the market in Beersheba to exchange desert products and animal products for grain. This is the kind of exchange that was going on. So then they take the grain already fully worked, and this is why there are no phytolites, I think, in the sites. And also
Is there any connection between Negev and Judea at all? Because we get the impression that everything's going between, it stays something between Egypt and Benin. You had a theory, I suppose, still you agree with your own theory that Moab existed because of that. Was there any influence we have pointed?
Ajud is later. Ajud is the first half of the 8th century, so it's later. But your question is good about before. I mean,
what's the connection between
in Judea? Yeah.
If there's any.
So the only evidence that I can see for connections with Judea, with Judah of the time, let's say of the 9th century, in the archaeological evidence, in the archaeological record, certain, when one looks at the pottery from the Negev Highlands, part of the pottery is locally produced, and then you have the copper slag as inclusions and so on. Part of the pottery is produced in the north, and in the north it is divided. Most of the pottery from the north was produced in the less regions, which means more the side of Gaza, Ashkelon over there. The connection is mainly there, but here and there you can see also vessels which have properties that can fit the highlands, the southern highlands. But I think that the situation is more complicated. Here I turn from, my work in the Negev Highlands to my understanding of the situation in the Beersheba Valley, for instance. I think that the expansion of Judah from the highlands, from being, a small entity in the highlands in the 10th century, in the beginning of the 9th century, the expansion into the Shephelah and into the Beersheba Valley can be dated to the Iron 2A, late Iron 2A. I would, now I'm going to split the hair into two. I should say even what I call, don't freak out please, late Iron 2A2. Which is really, we archaeologists tend to become ridiculous sometimes. But what do I mean by late Iron 2A2? It is better to explain it in historical terms. I think that the second half of the late Iron 2A, which is identifiable, Iron 2A generally is identifiable. Between the 1 and 2 I doubt. But in the second half of the 9th century is the period of domination of some sort of a short-lived Damascene empire in the region. And I think that the Damascene, it's all connected. The Damascene-Cyprus connections brought about a revival of Cyprus as supplier of copper, decline in the Araba, it was also maybe even an interest of the Damascene power to decline the Araba, to make the Araba decline. And since I believe that Judah at that time was a sort of a vassal of Damascus in the time of Hazael, for instance, there is even a hint about this in the second book of Kings, as you remember. Probably the expansion of Judah into the Beersheba Valley was part of this connection with the Damascene phase of the Iron 2A in the second half of the 9th century, let's say between 840 and 800 BC, something like that. So the meaning is that Judah, in fact, replaces the Negev Highlands phenomenon. So until about the middle of the 9th century, what you have in the Beersheba Valley, for instance, is the gateway community of Tel Masos, which is connected to the Negev Highlands and other sites like it. And then this system is replaced. So there is a decline of copper, decline of the Negev Highlands, decline of the sites of the gateway community in the economic decline in the Beersheba Valley, and all this is being replaced by Judah. So this is why I don't see I see them coming one after the other more than in parallel.
But this is the correct for the academy, be careful.
And I'm always careful of Jean-Baptiste, I've been careful of him for like 40 years or so. We know each other for a long time.
Yeah, okay. I speak French.
Allez, ça marche, oui. Mais...
Donc j'ai structuré d'allonger une conférence qui est déjà longue et qui dépasse peut-être le temps admis, mais je voudrais remercier pour avoir solidifié dans mon esprit le processus qu'il y a entre sédentarisation et l'exploitation du cuivre. La tentative vers l'Égypte, évidemment, était connue et mieux documentée. Donc, merci pour ces résultats que nous n'avons pas, nous, parce que nous n'avons pas ce luxe d'analyse et d'archéométrie. Mais je pensais tout du long à une longue expérience que nous avons faite, une grande exploration en Transjordanie où on a trouvé aussi les sites de cette sédentarisation. Peut-être nous sommes-nous trompés, mais nous avons daté cette sédentarisation à partir de 3500, 3300, avec un pic d'humidité qui est très clair, très clairement marqué. Le problème qui nous intéressait, c'est de savoir d'où ces gens venaient. Et où sont-ils allés? Parce qu'ils ont disparu. Alors, d'où venaient-ils? Nous sommes allés voir au fond de l'Arabie, où alors les équipes françaises ont travaillé Serge Clegiou, Tosi, qui ont exploité des villages au bord de l'océan, en face du Pakistan,
oui.
Et qui m'ont dit, je lui ai montré quelques vestiges que nous avions, il m'a dit, mais nous avons les mêmes. Parce qu'il y a eu à ce moment-là, à partir de 3600, même pour lui, il y a eu une espèce d'invasion qui est partie de l'Est et qui a buté sur le Jourdain. Donc il y a eu ces milliers de sites, on en a exploré une centaine, qui étaient strictement pastoraux. Et il y a donc une espèce de décroissance sèche. Que sont-ils devenus? On ne sait pas. Mais en tout cas, vers 3300, 3200, alors les grandes agglomérations, Djebel Moutawak, se fondent avec les aiguilles de cuivre.
So yes, I will answer in English, okay? I can answer in French, but my French is,
Very good.
spoken, comme ci comme ça, spoken. Yeah. My spoken French is not as good as my understanding. Anyway, so did you understand the question? Okay, fine. So my answer, Jean-Baptiste, is I fully agree with this wave of settlement in the late 4th millennium BC in Transjordan, yeah, sure. And I also agree with you about the wet phase, because we see very clearly that the early Bronze 1, we are in the early Bronze 1 there, is wet, humid. This we see in all the records, all the proxies of paleoclimate, and in the, not only in Israel, around in the Levant and beyond. So, of course, activity could expand. Where they came from, I don't know. This is one of the questions that need to be verified in the future. I can tell you one thing. Breaking news now, okay? Now we are in the phase of breaking news. As you know, there is a lot going on today in ancient DNA. And the future is there in the ancient DNA. In order to answer a question like yours, of mapping the population, where they come from, I think that we have exhausted again, in this case too, we have exhausted the traditional archaeology. So we have to shift to DNA. And this is becoming possible, has been possible in the last few years. In the last 5 years, there is this expansion of research and number of articles and so on. I am involved now with a study of the population in the Bronze and Iron Ages. This is what is of interest for me, and this is connected to what you were asking about. Because we are going to publish a study of samples from several places in Israel, but mainly Megiddo. Because Megiddo provided us with the second millennium, with like 35 samples. First time that you have such a big number of results for ancient DNA. And but also from other places, even beyond the borders of Israel. There was a publication of population from Sidon recently in Lebanon, and there is also we also checked several sites. I mean, the extraction is being done in the United States, so also several sites. There is evidence for several sites in Jordan. For instance, from the area of Amman, from both the Neolithic and the Intermediate Bronze Age. So what we see is basically something very interesting for the second millennium, which is connected, wait a minute, to what you're asking me. We see that the population of the second millennium, middle second millennium, in what you call it, Canaan, Levant, whatever you want to call it, is a combination of local Neolithic genetic pool with the introduction, starting maybe early in the Chalcolithic, but definitely in the third millennium, introduction of groups from the northeast of the ancient Near East. So you can call it northern Iraq, northeastern Iran, Caucasus, call them early Bronze Bet Yerach people, whatever, call them Hurrians, whatever you want to call them. However, there are two samples, if I remember well, from the Bekaa, northeast of Amman. And from there, we see something different, a third component, which does not fit neither the local Neolithic, if you wish, local pool of genetic pool, neither nor the northeast. And the idea that we are checking now is what you mentioned. Maybe then, because over there we are dealing with the desert fringe, maybe we are dealing with groups that are related to desert, Arabian Peninsula, whatever. So I think it's a long answer, but maybe this is the line of research that we need to take in the coming future. And I put much hope in this in order to answer your question, where did they come from in 3300 BC?
Last question.
Yes, Joe.
I think it's very interesting. Particularly since, seeing archaeology the last 50 years is incredible what's happening today. My question is regarding these cattle. The cows, the cattle.
Cattle, yes.
The cattle. Is it Sephardic Jews have one of the highest rates of being lactose intolerant? as opposed to Jews from Europe. Basically, if you look at the Asians and then the Africans, Sephardic Jews are very, very lactose intolerant, which means they simply cannot tolerate milk. And I'm curious, is that you can tell by looking at the cattle as to whether or not they're being milked or not, simply by looking at the cortex. And the animal bones, the cattle that you find there, are they being milked? Do you know, or are they just simply used for plowing? Do you know?
We don't. For the first part of your answer, the answer is negative. Question, the answer is negative. I mean, I don't know, at least. Then I never conducted the study of this. So regarding the cows, I don't know. Well, you know, we spoke about it before. Karen wants now to carry out, this project on the third millennium. So who knows what will come up there. For the camels, no. The camels they are theoretical. We don't have any samples from the region for the time being. All this camel business is some sort of a theoretical construct.
But do you find this at other sites as well, a lot of cattle?
Yes, but what is surprising is the balance between cattle and sheep goats. In Massos, for instance, in the Iron 2A, is not what you expect and not what you see in Iron 2 Beersheba or in Tel Ira or in Arad and so on. You see something different and something abnormal for this region, which means that there was some sort of necessity for more cattle. So I suppose that the cattle, in order to tell you whether the cattle is for the plow or for consumption of meat, we need to look at the age of slaughter. And indeed there is a clue there, because the age of slaughter in much of them is older cattle. Older cattle is usually an indication for the plow, rather than young cattle, which is more for consumption. So there is another hint there, yes.
So I think this lecture was a very good introduction to the next field trip with Dominic Barry in Negev, where they will be visiting the copper industry places. And thank you so much, Israel, for
coming.
Sure, really.
Pleasure.